She married the millionaire who pity chose her, but on their wedding night, her true beauty shattered his pride. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We have noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It is quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great stories like this one. Your support means everything to us. Let us keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us go back to our main character. He married her out of pity tonight. One truth will break his pride. Rain slid down the glass walls of the Cole Tower penthouse, streaking the city lights into trembling ribbons of gold. Inside, silence ruled cold, deliberate, the kind that filled expensive rooms when love had long stopped visiting. Julian Grant stood near the window, his reflection fractured by raindrops. The faint hum of traffic below only made the quiet louder. He did not look at the woman standing across the marble table. He only looked at the document between them, two signatures waiting to seal a deal neither of them wanted to admit was desperate. "Marry me," he said flatly, his voice as measured as the rain outside. "Think of it as a solution, not love." Across from him, Lila Moore swallowed hard. Her hands trembled as she glanced down at the contract. Her nails were short, her palms calloused from years working in a tailor's shop. The faint scent of thread and soap clung to her skin. "Why me?" she asked quietly. Julian finally met her eyes. "Because you are not after my name. You need this marriage as much as I do." He said it like a man negotiating a merger, not a vow. The truth was cruel but clear. His father's will demanded he be married before turning 33. Or the family shares of Grant Holdings would pass to his cousin. Her mother lay in a hospital bed with bills Lila could never afford. The deal was ugly, but so was survival. Julian reached into his jacket pocket and placed a simple silver ring on the table. It glimmered under the white light, beautiful but lifeless. "You will have everything you need," he said. "A home, protection, medical coverage for your mother. In return, you attend 6 months of public events as my wife. Then we part ways." Lila stared at the ring. Her throat tightened. For a moment, she thought of her mother's tired smile, the steady beep of the heart monitor, the nurse whispering that time was running out. Finally, she nodded. "Fine. 6 months." Julian's jaw flexed, but his tone stayed cool. "Good. My assistant will arrange everything. The wedding will be quiet. I do not like attention." He signed his name with practiced precision. Lila took the pen, her fingers shaking. When her name bled onto the page beside his, it felt like selling a piece of her soul for a heartbeat more of her mother's life. As Julian stood, he slipped the ring onto her finger. The metal was cold. "You are Mrs. Grant now," he said. "Do not take it personally. This is just business." Lila looked up at him, her voice soft but steady. "Maybe for you. For me, it is a promise." Julian turned away before her words could reach him. Outside, thunder rolled across the skyline, echoing through the glass tower like a warning neither of them would understand until much later, when pity would burn into pride and pride would finally learn how to love. The next morning, Lila Moore woke to the pale light seeping through thin curtains. The sound of the city felt distant, as if she were watching life from behind glass. Her small apartment above the tailor shop smelled faintly of fabric dye and coffee gone cold. The wedding ring on her finger caught the light cold, unfamiliar, and heavy. For the first time in years, her sewing machine sat silent. A stack of unfinished dresses waited beside it, their threads still tangled from the night she stopped working to take her mother to the hospital. The doctors had been kind, but kind words did not pay for medicine. The number on the bill had followed her home like a shadow. Now, that shadow had a name. Mrs. Grant. She turned the ring slowly, feeling its weight press into her skin. The metal was smooth, perfect, untouched by time, just like him. Julian Grant, the man who saw marriage as a transaction, who did not even flinch when he said the word solution. She wondered if he had ever loved anything at all. Her phone buzzed on the counter. "A message from the hospital. Your mother's condition is stable, but further treatment is required." Lila exhaled a shaky breath. Stable was good. Stable meant there was still time. Across town, Julian adjusted his cufflinks in front of the mirror in his penthouse. The reflection staring back at him was as precise as every deal he had ever made. He had married Lila out of necessity, not emotion. That was what he told himself. It was all for control, control of his inheritance, his reputation, his father's empire. He did not believe in chaos, and love, in his mind, was the most dangerous chaos of all. His assistant, Daniel, entered quietly. "The board has been informed, sir. They believe the marriage will strengthen the family image." Julian nodded. "Good. Make sure the press knows nothing else." He looked out the window again. The skyline stretched endlessly, yet it all felt hollow. He had won every deal in his life, but this one, this strange marriage to a woman who had nothing, felt less like a victory and more like a confession. That afternoon, Lila returned to the hospital. The corridors smelled of disinfectant and whispered prayers. Her mother lay sleeping, thin and pale, her hand resting loosely in Lila's. "Mom," Lila whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her mother's forehead, "you are going to be fine. I promise." Her mother's eyes fluttered open. "You look different, sweetheart. Is that a ring?" Lila hesitated. "It is. Someone offered help, and I took it." Her mother smiled faintly, too weak to ask more. "You always carried more heart than luck, Lila. Maybe this time life will be kind." The words hit deeper than her mother knew, because this was not kindness. It was a bargain. And yet, when Lila stepped out of the hospital and felt the evening wind against her face, she could not shake the strange thought that maybe bargains sometimes lead to miracles. That night, as she packed her few belongings into a small suitcase, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The same brown eyes, the same worn face, but something in her gaze had changed. There was no fear now, only resolve. Tomorrow she would move into Julian Grant's world, a world of glass walls and quiet judgment. She would learn his rules, play his part, and survive. But as the city lights flickered outside her window, Lila whispered to herself, 6 months, just 6 months. And somewhere across the skyline, in a room of marble and silence, Julian poured himself a drink he did not even want. The storm outside was fading, but inside both of them, something restless had already begun to move, something that neither money nor pride could control. The ceremony was small, deliberate, and cold, exactly the way Julian Grant wanted it. There were no flowers, no guests, no music, just a notary, his assistant Daniel, and 2 signatures that changed everything. The marble floor of the city courthouse reflected their images, like ghosts caught in glass. When the clerk pronounced them husband and wife, Julian's hand barely brushed Lila's. It was the kind of touch that meant nothing, and yet her pulse still jumped. She told herself it was not hope, it was fear. Fear of stepping into a life that did not belong to her. Outside, the January wind cut through her thin coat as they walked toward the black sedan waiting by the curb. Julian opened the door without looking at her. "We will head straight to the house," he said. "You will be briefed when we arrive." She nodded silently and slid into the back seat. The car smelled of leather and rain. The city blurred past, tall buildings rising like monuments to the people who owned the world. Somewhere in that blur, she tried to remember who she had been before all this, before she became Mrs. Grant by contract. The mansion sat on the outskirts of Manhattan, a world away from the crowded streets she knew. When the gates opened, the sound of metal grinding felt final, like the closing of a chapter she would never get back. A housekeeper greeted them at the door with a polite bow. "Welcome home, Mrs. Grant," she said. The title felt foreign, borrowed. Julian handed his coat to the staff and gestured toward the grand staircase. "You will stay in the east wing. My quarters are on the opposite side. It is better that way." She met his gaze for a moment. "You mean separate lives under one roof?" He did not deny it. "The rules are simple," he said, his tone steady but cold. "Rule 1, do not interfere with my business. Rule 2, attend public events as my wife, nothing more. Rule 3, when the 6 months end, you leave quietly. You will receive everything promised in writing." Lila's fingers tightened around her small purse. "You have thought of everything. I have learned to," he said, walking past her. Life rarely forgives the unprepared. For a while, she stood alone in the vast foyer. The air was too clean, the silence too perfect. She could hear her own heartbeat echoing in the marble walls. When a maid guided her to the east wing, Lila thanked her softly. The woman hesitated, lowering her voice. He is not a bad man, ma'am. Just locked behind his own walls. That night, Lila unpacked her suitcase. 2 dresses, 1 photograph of her mother, and a sketchbook she had carried since college. It was filled with designs she never had time to finish. She placed it on the nightstand beside the untouched bed. Down the hall, Julian sat in his study, the contract lying open on the desk. The ink from their signatures had barely dried. He stared at her name, Lila Moore Grant, and tried to ignore the uneasy tug in his chest. He had done what was necessary. It was all perfectly logical. But why did her eyes linger in his mind, steady and unafraid? Outside, snow began to fall, brushing the tall windows in slow, fragile flakes. Lila stood by her window, watching it, whispering to herself. It is just 6 months. And somewhere down the hall, Julian whispered the same words, as if repeating them could keep his heart from breaking its own rules. Morning sunlight spilled across the marble floors of the Grant estate, soft but cold, like everything else that belonged to Julian's world. The staff moved quietly through the hallways, and every sound seemed to echo. Lila Moore Grant stood by the window in the east wing, her hands wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee. The city skyline shimmered in the distance, unreachable. Her first week as Mrs. Grant had passed like a blur of unfamiliar faces and whispered rules. The housekeeper, Mrs. Turner, had been kind enough to guide her through the routine, what time meals were served, where the charity events were scheduled, which public appearances she would need to attend. Everything was precise, planned, and soulless. In the beginning, Lila had thought she could simply survive by following directions, but she soon realized that survival in Julian's world required performance. That afternoon, Mrs. Turner brought a folder to her room. "Mr. Grant asked that you begin etiquette lessons immediately," she said gently. "There will be a stylist arriving at noon." Lila smiled faintly. A stylist? I suppose even fake wives must look the part. The older woman hesitated. "Sometimes pretending becomes real, dear. Just be patient with yourself." When the stylist arrived, the east wing turned into a whirlwind of fabrics and mirrors. Lila tried on gowns she had never imagined touching: silk, velvet, satin. The woman adjusted her hair, taught her to hold a wine glass properly, to walk without letting her nerves show. For hours, Lila practiced smiling in the mirror, and each time the reflection looked more like a stranger. Later that evening, she was escorted to the main dining room where Julian waited. The chandelier cast a golden glow over the long mahogany table. He rose when she entered, his expression unreadable. "You look different," he said simply. "I suppose that is the point," she replied, sitting down across from him. Dinner passed mostly in silence, interrupted only by the quiet clink of silverware. Lila could feel his gaze on her, assessing, distant but not cruel. When she reached for the glass, her hand trembled slightly. Julian noticed. "You do not need to impress anyone tonight," he said. "This is not one of those events." She set the glass down, meeting his eyes. "Maybe not, but I still have to convince the world that we belong in the same photograph." Something flickered behind his expression, perhaps regret, perhaps admiration, but it disappeared before she could name it. Over the next few weeks, Lila followed a routine that felt like a movie montage she could not escape. She attended private lessons on art history and fashion etiquette. She learned which fork belonged to which course, which smile worked best for the cameras, and which charities Julian's company sponsored. At night, she returned to her room, removed the diamonds, and wrote in her old sketchbook. Her lines were softer now, women in elegant gowns, faces half hidden, as if unsure of who they had become. Julian often passed her in the fanned halls, always polite, always distant. Yet sometimes, when she laughed with Mrs. Turner or helped a gardener carry flowers into the atrium, he paused without realizing it. The sound of her laughter did something to the house. It made the silence seem less powerful. One afternoon, he found her alone in the library, reaching for a book too high on the shelf. Without thinking, he stepped forward and took it down for her. Their hands brushed briefly. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded, the air between them tightening in a way neither understood. "You should read that one. It is about people who pretend to be something they are not." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe it is exactly what I need." As she walked away, Julian watched her go, wondering when his carefully built world had started to shift. Outside, snow continued to fall over the city, but inside the mansion, something subtle and human had begun to thaw. The night of the charity gala arrived sooner than Lila expected. The mansion buzzed with quiet preparation from dawn. Florists came and went, drivers polished cars, and staff moved like clockwork through every corridor. It was Julian Grant's first major appearance since the wedding, and his new wife would be at his side. In her dressing room, Lila sat before the mirror while the stylist pinned her hair into soft waves. The pale silver gown shimmered like frost under the warm lights. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. The girl who once stitched other people's dreams now wore one. Mrs. Turner adjusted the final piece of jewelry, a single diamond bracelet. "Remember, dear," she said, smiling softly, "tonight you do not owe anyone an apology for being here." Lila nodded. "I will try to remember that." When Julian entered the room a few minutes later, he stopped at the doorway. For a moment, words failed him. He had seen beauty every day of his life, in art, in architecture, in power, but this was different. Lila looked real, effortless, not perfect, but alive. "You clean up well, Mrs. Grant," he said finally, his tone steady, though his eyes betrayed something warmer. "And you always look like you stepped out of a magazine," she replied with a hint of humor. In the car on the way to the event, silence settled between them, but it was not uncomfortable. The city lights swept across her face, and Julian found himself watching her reflection in the window more than the road ahead. The ballroom of the Grant Foundation shimmered with gold and crystal. Cameras flashed, guests whispered, and the orchestra's music floated through the air. As they entered, all eyes turned to them. Julian rested a careful hand on Lila's back, guiding her through the crowd. For the first half hour, everything went according to plan. They greeted board members, posed for photographs, and smiled on cue. Lila's nervousness faded as she began to speak with guests. Her genuine warmth surprised even Julian. People listened to her, drawn to her quiet sincerity. But peace never lasted long in a room built on wealth. Near the buffet table, a woman in a red gown approached them, her smile sharp. "Julian, I see your taste has changed," she said lightly. "Last year you brought investors. This year you brought charity." A few guests nearby chuckled. The air froze. Julian's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Lila turned to the woman with calm grace. "You are right," she said. "I am here because of charity, but not the kind that seeks attention. The kind that reminds people we are all human." The woman's smirk faltered. A ripple of silence spread around them. Then, softly, people began to clap, just a few at first, then more. Julian looked at Lila with a mix of surprise and pride. He had expected her to retreat, but she had stood taller than anyone in the room. Later, during the speeches, the host invited Lila to say a few words on behalf of the foundation. She hesitated, glancing at Julian, who gave a small nod. Stepping up to the microphone, she took a deep breath. "When I first came into this world," she began, "I thought charity was about giving money, but I have learned that true charity is about giving respect. Sometimes the smallest kindness can restore someone's dignity. Tonight, let us not just donate, let us see each other." The applause that followed was louder this time, genuine, warm, and echoing. When she returned to the table, Julian leaned closer. "You handled that better than most politicians I know." Lila smiled faintly. "I was not trying to handle anything. I was just telling the truth." For the rest of the night, his eyes kept finding her in the crowd. Something had shifted between them, subtle but real. Pride had softened into admiration, and pity had started to turn into something dangerously close to love. Outside, snow continued to fall over the city, but inside the ballroom, beneath the chandeliers, Julian Grant realized that for the first time in years, his heart had stopped feeling cold. The gala ended hours ago, but the night lingered like a song that refused to fade. Lila stood on the balcony of the Grant estate, the city lights below blinking through the mist. The silk gown still clung to her frame, the diamond bracelet catching the moonlight as she turned it slowly around her wrist. Inside, the mansion was quiet, but her heart was not. Julian had barely spoken on the drive home. He had looked out the window the entire time, jaw set, eyes distant. Yet something about his silence was different, less cold, more searching. Now she could still hear the faint echo of his words from earlier. You handled that better than most politicians I know. It was not praise, not entirely, but there had been pride hidden underneath. When she heard footsteps behind her, she knew it was him before she turned. Julian stepped onto the balcony, still in his tuxedo, his tie loosened. For the first time since their marriage, he looked less like a CEO and more like a man trying to find his footing. You should be resting, he said quietly. I could say the same to you, she replied without turning. Big nights usually end with big thoughts. He gave a small, almost reluctant smile. You did well tonight. The board members were impressed. Even my mother called. And what did she say? That she finally understands why I married you? He hesitated, watching her reaction. I am not sure I do. Lila turned to face him, her voice steady but soft. Maybe you do not need to understand it yet. For a moment, they stood in silence, the city stretching wide beneath them. The distance between them felt smaller now, not gone, but less impossible. Julian finally spoke again, his voice low. You surprised me. Most people in that room care about perception. You cared about meaning. I have spent most of my life being invisible, Lila said. When people finally look at me, I want it to count. He looked at her for a long time, his eyes tracing her face with a mix of curiosity and admiration. You really are not like anyone I have met before. Good, she said with a faint smile, because I do not want to be another file in your cabinet. That made him laugh, softly, almost boyishly. The sound startled her more than the words. It was warm, genuine, unguarded proof that the man inside the armor was real after all. They lingered there longer than either expected. The city hummed quietly below, and the wind carried the faint scent of rain. At one point, a strand of hair slipped from her pinned curls, and Julian reached out to fix it. His hand stopped halfway, hesitating, then gently tucked it behind her ear. Lila felt her breath catch. You do not have to pretend to be kind, she said, though her tone lacked conviction. I am not pretending, he replied. Not anymore. The space between them dissolved into quiet understanding. There were no declarations, no promises, only the awareness that something fragile and real had begun to form between them. When she finally stepped back toward the door, he spoke softly. Good night, Lila. She turned slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. Good night, Julian. He watched her disappear down the hall, the faint echo of her footsteps mingling with the sound of rain starting again. He stood there long after she had gone, staring into the storm, wondering when pity had turned into respect, and respect into something much more dangerous. The snow began to fall again before midnight, gentle and relentless. Inside, in separate rooms divided by marble and pride, both of them lay awake. For the first time since their cold, calculated marriage began. Neither of them was thinking about the contract. They were thinking about each other. The deepest secrets are about to change everything. Subscribe now to catch the dramatic twist that is coming in the next chapter. The morning after the gala brought a silence that felt heavier than usual. Lila woke to the faint sound of voices echoing from the hall. When she opened her door, 2 house staff members stopped speaking abruptly, their faces tense. One of them held a folded newspaper. She did not have to ask. The headline was printed in bold across the front page. Grant marriage exposed, a 6-month contract deal. Her chest tightened as she scanned the text. Someone had leaked the truth. Every detail was there: rumors of a fake marriage, whispers about her background, and speculation about Julian's motives. The world that had just begun to accept her was now tearing her apart. Julian found her minutes later, standing in the foyer, the paper trembling in her hands. His face was pale with anger. This is not supposed to happen, he said sharply. I will. Handle it. Handle it. Her voice cracked. They are calling me a fraud, Julian. They are saying I sold myself to you. He looked at her, the muscles in his jaw tightening. You know the truth. That is all that matters. It might be enough for you, she whispered, but I am the one people are laughing at. Before he could answer, Daniel rushed in with a phone. The board is already calling, sir. They want a statement immediately. They are demanding you annul the marriage to protect the company. Julian's expression hardened. Tell them I will deal with it myself. Lila could not bear to stay another moment. She turned away, tears welling despite her effort to stay calm. "You told me this was just business," she said. "Now I know you meant it." "Lila, wait." But she was already walking down the stairs, her voice shaking. "Do not follow me. I need to remember who I was before this deal." That night, Julian sat alone in his study, the newspaper lying open on the desk beside the untouched glass of whiskey. The ink on the page blurred as the city lights flickered outside. Every word felt like a mirror, forcing him to face the truth he had avoided for weeks. He had built his life on control, but this time, he had lost something he could not replace. Lila's absence filled the mansion like a wound. The house that once felt quiet now felt empty. Across town, Lila checked her mother out of the hospital and moved into a modest apartment. She unpacked her few belongings, her sketchbook, her ring, her mother's photo, and placed them on a small table by the window. The world might have branded her a liar, but at least here, she could breathe again. Still, when she looked out at the snow-covered city, one thought refused to fade. Not anger, not shame, but the ache of missing him. Days turned into weeks, but the storm around Julian Grant's name refused to fade. The media continued to circle like vultures, printing stories about his so-called sham marriage. Investors demanded answers, and the board threatened to suspend his position if he did not make a public statement soon. Julian ignored every call. He had spent his life protecting the company's image, but this time, the only thing he wanted to protect was gone. His world felt quiet without Lila, the laughter in the halls, the soft warmth that had once filled the cold spaces of his home. Every night he walked past her empty room, and every time he reached for the door, he stopped himself. Pride had never felt so bitter. One afternoon, he left the tower without telling anyone. He drove through falling snow until the city skyline disappeared behind him. The hospital where Lila's mother had stayed appeared at the edge of the road, small and tired-looking. Inside, he found Lila sitting beside her mother, reading softly from a book. The moment she saw him, her body went still. "Why are you here, Julian?" she asked, quietly. He took a slow breath. "Because I needed to tell you something. You were right. This marriage started as business, but it became everything I did not know I needed." Lila looked away. "You do not have to say this because of guilt." "This is not guilt," he said firmly. "It is the truth. You changed the way I see everything, my work, my family, myself. I let my pride destroy what was real." She shook her head, tears glinting in her eyes. "The world knows about the contract, Julian. Even if I believed you, they never will." "Then let them see the truth," he said. 2 days later, Julian walked onto the stage of the company's annual press conference. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and the board sat stone-faced in the front row. He held the microphone with steady hands and began to speak. "Yes, the rumors are true," he said. "I married Lila Moore through a contract. But what began as a deal became a revelation. She taught me that integrity is not in documents or wealth, it is in the courage to care." He lifted a folded piece of paper from the podium, the original marriage contract, and tore it in half before the crowd. The sound of ripping paper echoed across the room. "This contract is over," he said. "But my promise to her is not." Across the city, Lila watched the broadcast on a small television in her apartment. Her hand covered her mouth as tears slipped down her cheeks. For the first time in months, she believed him. Outside, snow kept falling, but the world suddenly looked brighter. A full year passed before their paths crossed again. Winter had returned to New York, soft and quiet, the kind of cold that invited reflection instead of pain. Lila Moore Grant had built a small life of her own, simple, peaceful, and honest. She taught design classes at a community arts center and spent her evenings painting in the same worn sketchbook she once carried through the mansion. The world had stopped whispering about her. For the first time in a long while, she felt like herself again. One morning, an envelope arrived at her studio. There was no name on the front, only an address and invitation to the opening of a new charity exhibition hosted by the Grant Foundation. For a long moment, she stood frozen, the paper trembling in her hands. She almost tore it up. Almost. But something inside her whispered that unfinished stories deserved closure. That evening, she arrived at the gallery dressed simply, her hair loose. her heart steady. The place shimmered with soft lights and quiet piano music. Guests moved through the hall, admiring the photographs on the walls, portraits of women from different backgrounds, each captioned with a single word: strength, grace, resilience, hope. Then she saw the final piece at the end of the corridor. It was her, a black and white portrait taken at the gala, her expression calm, her eyes unguarded. The title beneath it read, "The Woman Who Changed the Way I See." Her breath caught. Behind her, a familiar voice said softly, "I hoped you would come." Lila turned. Julian stood a few feet away, dressed simply, no tie, no pretense. There was warmth in his eyes that she had never seen before. "You did all this?" she asked. He nodded. "Every photograph here is of someone who reminded me that dignity has nothing to do with power. You taught me that first." She looked at him for a long time. "You could have moved on, Julian. You had no reason to wait." "I did not want to move on," he said. "I wanted to make things right, and maybe ask if you would let me start over without contracts, without conditions." For a moment, the only sound was the quiet hum of the piano. Then Lila smiled faintly and held out her hand. "Only if you promise to keep learning." He took her hand gently, his thumb brushing the edge of the silver ring he had once given her. She looked down and noticed something. New engraved inside it 3 small words: "No terms, only love." A soft laugh escaped her lips. "You always did have a way with words." He smiled. "This time, I mean them." As the music swelled and the guests continued to wander through the gallery, Lila leaned her head against his shoulder. The storm that had once destroyed them had finally turned into peace. Outside, the snow kept falling. Not as a curtain this time, but as a quiet blessing on a love that had finally learned to be real. Thank you for joining us for this cinematic adventure. If you want more untold stories of billionaire love and redemption, please subscribe and choose your next true heart journey on your screen now.